It's Jason that you'd like to be called, is it?
Yes, please.
Very well. Well, Jason, in a moment, Mary will ask you to take the oath, and then we'll take it from there. We have, for those who are watching remotely, we have what is, for us under current restrictions, a full house, both in this chamber and below. But there will be, I expect, something in the region of 300 or 400 people watching you outside, and they're the public to whom you're talking. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Jason Jonathan Evans.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Jason, you've not given oral evidence to the inquiry before, and so I'm going to start by asking you about your personal experiences and what happened to your father, and then we'll come on and talk about your campaigning and investigative activities.
Yes.
So your father was Jonathan, and
yes.
He had haemophilia A.
He did, yeah, born in 1962, and a kind of a few years into his life, he developed the usual bruises and was diagnosed with haemophilia A.
And he was infected with HIV and with hepatitis C as a result of his treatment with factor concentrates.
Yes.
He died in October 1993. How old was he?
He was 31 when he died.
And how old were you?
4.
And because of your young age at the time of his death, you don't have, I think, much first-hand knowledge of the circumstances in which he was infected.
Correct.
But I know you've tried through looking at his records, and we'll come on to some issues about records later, but looking at his records to find out what you can. But before we look at some things your mum said in her statement, and indeed your dad's own HIV litigation statement, what, if anything, have you learnt about his treatment or what he was told?
I think the one thing that stands out to me is, and it's in his medical records, he raised his own concerns about possible AIDS transmission through factor products from media reports during the course of mid-84. At that time, he reverted to cryo for one treatment. His doctor convinced him, don't know what you're on about, media sensationalism, convinced him to go back onto concentrates. Then later that year, he tested positive for HIV. Knowing what I now know, that happened at a time when I think that haemophilia clinician, Shinton, at Coventry, was wrong to have done that.
Your dad, I think, received treatment at a number of different centres.
Yes.
Coventry at that point. He'd also been treated at Oxford.
Yes, a mix of Coventry and Oxford. Later on, once he had tested positive for HIV, he received much of his HIV care at Oxford, but also in his younger days, he was treated at Birmingham Children's as well.
And do you know which particular factor concentrates he was treated with?
Everything under the sun, to put it bluntly. Various BPL products, Hemofil by Baxter, Factor 8 by Armour. It would probably be easy to explain which ones he wasn't given, which would be things like the Spaywood product, for example.
Your mum, in her statement, has identified that, according to his record, she thinks he started home treatment in 1976 and first given Factor 8 concentrate in 1977.
That's my understanding.
And there's reference to him having hepatitis B and being jaundiced in 76, 77.
Yes.
And then she also identifies records which refer to hepatitis in 1983 when he was being treated at Walsgrove Hospital for a knee problem.
That sounds correct, yeah.
I'm going to put a bit of your mum's statement on the screen because it describes how she and your father learnt about his diagnosis, and it's probably best done in her own written words. Shomik, it's WITN 1678001, please. And your mum, Sandra, says this, if we go to page 2. We pick it up, paragraph 7, we can see that she refers to John, that's your dad, and I were married in June 1984. And then she says this, before we married, I was at home when my father saw something on the news about a Scottish man dying as a result of receiving bad blood products. My father told me, I immediately told John, who was in the hospital, and told him. He demanded to be put on cryoprecipitate, but they reassured him there was nothing to worry about and it was just a one-off case. That's what you referred to a few months ago. John was under Dr. Shinton at CWMH, that's Coventry and Warwickshire Hospital, and had received treatment from him for a long time. John even invited Dr. Shinton to our wedding. In March 1985, John was referred to Oxford to see whether the haemophilia unit there would treat him because he was having so many problems with bleeds in his knees. And then this, in the spring of 1985, Dr. Shinton invited us into his office for a chat. He shuffled through John's medical notes when he casually said, "Your test results are positive." We were extremely confused and asked what test results. He then said, John had been diagnosed with HIV. He also told us there was no cure. We asked when John would die, but Dr. Shinton said he didn't know. And then there's reference to saying that there shouldn't be any sexual contact or kissing or sharing toothbrushes. And then paragraph 13, we asked when John had been tested. He said it was some time ago. John's notes show that he first tested positive in November 1984. This means Dr. Shinton likely knew about John's test results for months, but he still neglected to tell John the results of the test. So that's your mother's recollection, and it's obvious from her account she was there with your father when he received this news of how they were told.
Yes, and what she outlines here is supported by the medical records I've read as well.
And then if we just look at paragraph 14, the next paragraph, we were absolutely gobsmacked. We walked into that office happy, having only married a year previously, and came out with the knowledge that our lives had changed forever. I'm going to go into some of the ways in which their lives were changed and then how your life was changed in a moment. But before we do that, what memories do you have of your father, Jason?
Very little direct, happy memories. I remember the funeral very well, and him dying, and other things that are very negative that it's probably best for me not to go into detail about. Nothing happy is the answer.
The stigmatising effect of the AIDS diagnosis is something that your mum talks about, and we'll look at that in a moment. But we can hear from your dad in a video, and we can hear from your dad's words in his HIV litigation statement. So if we start with the video, Shomik, could we play JEVA 5074, please? We'll see your mum and
John got the AIDS virus after receiving contaminated blood which hadn't been screened. Although he carries the virus, he hasn't got AIDS. Sandra's lost her part-time job because colleagues thought she was a health risk. She'd given up a full-time job because she wanted to spend more time with her husband. Now both are out of work.
I'm very upset and really disgusted at what's happened. And I just hope it doesn't happen to anybody else in our situation in the future.
What do you think of what's happened, John?
I'm very upset. It's quite devastating, actually, to find out that your wife's been dismissed from work because of something that's wrong with me. No, Sandra's perfectly in the clear, and yet she's the one who gets victimised because of something that's actually wrong with me.
Do you think what's happened stems from basic ignorance?
Definitely, yeah. I think people just don't take in, the news that they read. As soon as anything's mentioned about AIDS, everybody gets really worried. So, yeah.
Do you feel bitter about it?
Yeah. Pretty upset. I mean, Sandra was in tears when she told me. and it does tend to upset both of us.
Vern Sheldon, who owns the baker's shop in Tamworth, claims Sandra was not sacked but decided to leave after staff complained. But Mr Sheldon did admit that he was worried about how customers would react and the fact that Sandra would be working with sharp instruments.
I've decided I'm not going to tell anybody else, even that John's a haemophiliac, because he automatically put the two together. And I can't afford to lose another job. I'm out of work now, but I intend to look for another job.
So that's the video we've got of your parents talking about what happened.
The hairstyles and trousers of the 80s.
One of the striking things about the video might be said to be the fact that your dad described it as being something wrong with him.
Yeah, he did feel that way. There are other private letters I have at home that support that.
And then there's a newspaper article from around, I think, the same time, which your mum exhibited to her witness statement. And again, I just wanted to look at a little bit of that. It's WITN 1678002. We go to the next page. Again, it relates to how your mum lost her job, and it gives both your mum's perspective and the employer's perspective. But it was really just what your dad said, again, that I wanted to pick up. So, Seamus, under the heading Exclusive by Sue Robinson, could you just do the column under that is what I wanted to refer to. It says this: Mr. Evans, who had had to give up work last year, added, "I feel as though all this is my fault, and that I should have a bell round my neck, ringing it wherever I go, even though I haven't got AIDS." So, and that's your dad's perspective, thinking it was his responsibility.
Yeah, I think he felt responsible for what had happened to my mum.
There's a statement that we've got from your dad, prepared for the HIV litigation. And can we go to that, please, Seamus? It's WITN 1210002. We pick it up at the bottom of the next page, please. So we can see, I think the Dad gives the date there of July 1984. That might not be right given what your mum said and what you've told us about the records. But in any event, he talks about this. I started to develop rashes on my legs. I also started to suffer severe headaches, which resulted in sickness. In July 1989, I was extremely ill with a bout of gastric flu. I lost approximately 1.5 stones over a period of a few days. My weight came down from 9.5 stone to 8 stone. He describes then almost being back to his normal weight at that point in time. He describes then about suffering from night sweats. On occasions I've had to change the bed sheets in the night. And then he talks about being constantly exhausted. The smallest amount of physical exertion leaves me feeling totally worn out. And then if we go to the psychological, it says, my reaction to being told that I was HIV positive was fear. I felt that the world had come to an end. I was told that I would die, but the hospital didn't know when. The manner in which I was told by Professor Shinton left a considerable amount to be desired. And then he refers again, and I think for present purposes the precise dates are probably less important than what he actually says, the gap between the test and being told.
Yeah,
your mum's name's been redacted there because initially she was anonymous, but...
So the solicitors had accidentally put things back a year, so you'll see rather than November 84 it's 83, and rather than July of 85 it's 84.
And so it's your mum's name, it's Sandra's name that we can say that's
yes.
Referred to there. And then if we go towards the bottom of that next paragraph, it's difficult to explain, but every aspect of my life, my own sanity, that of my wife, and the stability of our relationship came to an end. This had an immense effect on me. If anything, the fear of what has happened and what may happen in the future has got worse. Then there's reference to your mum's concerns about losing her job. And if we go over the page, we see various examples of the stigmatising effect of what had happened. So top of the page, your dad talks about losing contact with family, friends, your mum, his wife, losing her job, concern about not having children, and then your dad explains about how they confided in neighbours, but not long afterwards the neighbour in question came to our house and informed us that she felt it was her moral duty to tell everyone in the close of my condition. From then on, things gradually got worse. There's then again an account of the effect on your mum, crying home every night, extremely upset, losing her job, and the fact she'd already given up a full-time job to look after your dad. And then your dad refers to the news item we've just looked at, and I know you wanted to refer to this. So he says this: there was a subsequent spot on Central TV News. We were informed by Central that we would have the opportunity of putting our side of the story, and that is why we agreed to go on TV. However, after the news item appeared, we were completely ostracised. People would walk away from us or talk about us as we passed them, staring at us as if we were criminals. We began to receive abusive telephone calls and letters suggesting that we should be locked up to stop AIDS spreading in the community. Lots of hurtful things were said by people who we had never known before. It is difficult to explain to a third party the immense stress that all this created. And then he explains the toll that took upon his relationship with your mum.
Yes.
And if we go over the page, we see reference to your dad saying that they tried to start afresh in a new town, attempted to do this, but due to the HIV positive status, no one would give us a mortgage or any life insurance. In effect, we were left with no choice but to remain where we are. And then, again, there are some passages redacted, but I can read out the whole passages because the redaction should have been lifted because your mum's happy with this being said. Whilst all of this was going on, I was extremely depressed and felt that I could go on to develop AIDS at any time. These morbid thoughts completely occupied my mind.
Sorry, Jenny, can I just say, I think the last GROD, those two lines, I don't...
I'm not going to refer to that because that's not relevant. Yeah. These morbid thoughts completely occupied my mind. I became completely introspective, and then it refers essentially to your mum's fear and the effect upon the relationship of that fear. And then if we go down the page, we can see it says, quite frankly, in the 5 years that have passed on since I was diagnosed with being HIV positive, the life of my wife and myself have been hell. I believe that a fair amount of the pain and suffering would have been avoided had we known more about the disease, more about the way in which the general public were reacting to it. We both believe we've suffered immense psychological damage as a result of what has happened. I think those were the passages which perhaps most powerfully convey from your dad's perspective the impact. Was there anything else in this document that you would like to refer to?
No.
We know, of course, that your dad did develop AIDS, died only not long after. Your mum explains that in the course of his treatment he was given AZT and that made him extremely unwell.
Yes, that's right.
What was on the impact on you? After your dad died, you were very young, you were 4 years old. How did everything that happened affect you in the years that followed?
Well, this whole situation marked life in every way. At school, just general friends, the family, the whole family. Parts of the family didn't see each other. I didn't see my grandparents for about 12, 13 years, probably, for reasons which I won't go into, but it all relates to this. It marked every aspect of life. And, I've now lived my dad's entire lifespan, and I'm sat here. So it's blanketed my entire existence.
You were subjected to particular stigmatisation at school, I think.
Yes, This was, let me think, year 4, year 5, and we had a water fountain, and I'd gone to take a drink out of the water fountain, and there were 2 girls who, as I was leaving the water fountain, one said to the other, "Don't drink from that, that's the AIDS boy." Now, I had no idea what AIDS was, but that was the night I asked my mum about it. Because obviously I knew my dad had died, and I knew it was in what I'll refer to as mysterious circumstances. But I knew nothing of AIDS, HIV, or even haemophilia for that matter. So that was the night I asked my mum, "What is AIDS?" She explained in a very simple way, I think. It's something that makes you ill, something to that effect. And going through high school, I remember Tony referred to this, you hear all the AIDS jokes. I think it's long been the case. I think it still is the case now. I think we might like to pretend things have changed in certain sections of society, but overall they haven't. AIDS is the condition that is okay to joke about. It's funny. And we were subject to all that.
You described in your statement feeling very isolated and an impact upon your education.
Yeah, I had this view, I think, when I became a teenager, which now seems ridiculous. But at the time, my view was, without knowing any detail, the government had killed my dad, and therefore anything to do with or run by or funded by the government, or at the time I would have said global corporation, I just wanted nothing to do with it. And that included school, that included medicines, even basic things like aspirin or paracetamol. To this day, you'd have to catch me in a very bad situation to take any kind of medicine, which there's no rationale for it. It's just the impact it had left on me, which continues to this day, with the exception of my hay fever spray, which I have been taking this week.
And you described in your statement how you would inundate your mum with questions and some of your early internet researches, I think, to try and understand what had happened.
Yeah. One of my main memories about starting high school, which would have been 2000, 2001, was it was when Google became a thing for most of us. And I would plug in factor 8, contaminated blood, and at the time there wasn't actually a whole lot on the internet anywhere about any of it. But there were bits and pieces, and it was from those little bits and pieces I began to understand some basics, and I mean real basics. I mean, like, what is haemophilia? I didn't know that up until that point. And so, yeah, the internet began to enable me to learn about this. And I think it's also important to mention that my mother probably couldn't explain as much to me as she may have wanted to, because until this day, one of the reasons I asked her not to come today is she cannot talk or listen to this without crying. So it was on me to find out for myself to an extent.
You referred to the wider impact on family relationships. You were able to re-establish a relationship with your paternal grandparents after a number of years.
Yeah.
One of the details your statement says is your grandma later developed dementia, and in the latter stages of that she would call you by your father's name.
Yeah. It's tough, but she did.
You also observe in your statement, and could be relevant to one of the broader campaigning issues we come back to later, that you don't have anywhere to go to mourn your dad.
Correct. There was a bit of a family tradition, I guess. Well, it became a tradition where when my dad died, he had his ashes spread in his parents' garden on a rose bed. And subsequently, my grandparents have both had their ashes placed there as well. But suffice to say, they're gone. My dad's gone, and there is no grave, or anything. So, yeah, there is nowhere to go, and that's. I don't know. Actually, it's a horrible thing, but in a way, particularly as a teenager, maybe in some ways that was for the best. I don't know. Whether maybe it would have done more harm than good to be going to a grave every weekend, but yes, there is nowhere to go to remember him. Although, actually, in the lead up to my grandfather's death, he had paid, I think, something like £2,000 to the Coventry Cathedral to have a laser etching on a glass plaque in some memorial room there with my dad's name on, which was done. And so there is a plaque in Coventry Cathedral with his name on, which I was thankful for. And what's particularly sad about that is my granddad actually died a couple of weeks before the unveiling of that plaque, and he was super excited about that. But he never actually got to see it.
Your mum's provided in her statement further information about the stigmatising effect of the fears about AIDS. She talks about the way in which your dad was cared for in hospital, feeling like he was being quarantined. And then in terms of your own mum, I think when she was in hospital giving birth to you.
Yeah, she is no great fan of the experience of me being born because, and I remember other witnesses described this, people, dressed like spacemen, the kind of thing we see on the TV now with COVID, I guess, except HIV was not airborne and was understood not to be airborne. And the whole thing around me being born wasn't about, here's a brand new child, oh, what a great day. It was, hope no one gets AIDS.
You've also subsequently discovered, I think, that your dad had relations, biological siblings, half-siblings.
Yeah, so my dad was adopted at birth. His mother, his biological mother, if you like, was unmarried in the 60s, and it's kind of what happened. So he was given up for adoption at birth. And later on, and it was actually around the time of Penrose, I think, there was some change in the law around that time that allowed the descendants of adopted people to trace their biological family, which hadn't been possible for many years before that. So I happened to hear that on the radio, and to cut a long story short, I went through the process and I found them. His biological mother had died, but he had a sister. I met her. Again, I'm condensing parts of this story. I met her, and I actually rewinding back a bit. During the process of this adoption search, the agency had come to me and said, we found there was a sister, there was also a brother. And I had mentioned to them about haemophilia, its hereditary nature, and how that might be a clue within, the records they have access to. And the agency called me and they said, there was a brother, unfortunately, he's died, but we have his death certificate. And she said, I don't know what this is, but it says human immunodeficiency virus on the death certificate. And I proceeded to explain that I would be willing to place a large bet of how that happened. And it had. My dad's brother was co-infected and died 3 years after he did.
You've described in your statement making a lot of bad decisions because, as you've told us, you felt the system had killed your dad. You've described an impact on education, on employment, on relationships, on your own health and emotional and psychological well-being.
Yes.
Were you ever offered counselling or psychological support of any kind?
No, never. And I think the thing that is particularly despicable to me is, okay, now I'm 31, but as a child, as a 4, 5, 6-year-old kid, how did I not have bereavement counselling? How was it never offered? I mean, I think we know from the evidence this inquiry's heard how. It's because no one cared. The support wasn't there. But it's not right.
I'm going to move on in a moment to the question of your involvement in campaigning and how that came about and the work that you've done. Before I do so, is there anything else you want to say about your dad, what happened to him, or indeed the impact upon you personally?
No.
So, I think you've probably given us a clue to this already, Jason, in what you've said, but what led you to become involved in campaigning and investigation?
Well, aside from the personal impact on me and my family, the real crux for me was I'd observed the various campaigns on and off over the years since, I don't know, I was probably 11 or 12 years old, in all honesty. But I'd never made myself known, I'd never got involved. Actually, I probably, for a large part of my life, just believed it was all an unavoidable accident that no one could have foresaw. I mean, who would believe what I think many people here now accept as the truth? So I never questioned that narrative. But the crux for me really was 2015, when the Penrose inquiry was going to report. Up until then, this whole thing had been a peripheral issue for me, not in the sense of the personal impact, but in the sense of the campaign or thinking about becoming involved in campaigning. I booked the day off work for the day of the Penrose inquiry final report, and as was highlighted yesterday by Bill, it was not streamed live. You can watch it in that sense, but I think I was sat, in the Facebook groups just waiting for someone to type something, and just hitting refresh, waiting for some news. And then slowly but surely, the news began to trickle in of what was going on. And then later that night, I saw the news reports, saw the papers that followed, burning of the report, people walking out and shouting some not very nice things, which I agree with, by the way. But that day lit something, because I thought that was the day the campaign would be over. And for me, at least, it was the beginning. For many others, it had gone on for much longer. But for me, personally, that, for me, is when the campaign began.
You set up Factor 8. Was that the first step, or were there other things that you did before that?
No. Initially, I was involved with the Tainted Blood group, and that's certainly how I came to get to know many of the people that I know now. I think, to be honest, the first real campaigning step was the organising of the 2016 protest around the consultation on the schemes. Up until that point, I was doing real basics, I was... And in fact, the most important thing I think I did at that time wasn't looking at documents, it wasn't, trying to get the smoking gun, it was studying the history of the campaigning itself. And it's something I carried on doing ever since. And I do it, unknowingly with people in this room by finding out what had gone before and where I think things could have been done differently in terms of the campaigning and what had held people back, what had worked, what hadn't worked. That, I think, was very important, was studying the history of the actual campaigning itself and everything that had gone on before, a lot of which we've heard about this week.
Can I ask you then a little about Factor 8? I think it's Factor 8 Independent Haemophilia Group. What led you to set that up?
Well, as many of the people here and watching will know, there were a variety, and still are, of campaigning groups, organisations, charities, etc. I felt that I felt that the campaigns had become largely focused on the support schemes and/or monetary issues. And for very understandable reasons, because there'd been Archer, there'd been the 1990 HIV litigation, there'd been Penrose, and so it wasn't necessarily surprising that the focus had been on money and support, and all of these things to some extent have failed. So where else do we go? I think that was the general feeling and why that was the focus. Totally get it. I suppose the slight advantage for me is that I hadn't been through all of that directly. So for me, I wasn't yet, I don't want to say broken by it, but people were tired and worn out and exhausted, and they'd been up the mountain and down again so many times. They were worn out. Whereas I suppose one of the advantages that I had was being a bit fresher to, being treated in that way by the state. So I kind of felt like we should try and get a public inquiry. And I wasn't alone in that view. I know Tony shared that view, my anonymous friend. Many people here shared that view. But I don't think it was the then heads of the various campaigning organisations. Now, I mean, sure, it might say it, on a website, or if they were to be asked, the Haemophilia Society might say, yes, we'd like there to be a public inquiry. But as far as actually going for it and making that the core focus, not a potential side avenue that's so nice to have, that was where I felt we should go. And not just a public inquiry, it was also just legal routes. Let's get them in court, let's get a public inquiry. That's the focus. Forget the schemes, forget the support. Yes, I understand people need support, that they're suffering. My own family was a part of that. But the way I saw it was, my dad was suffering and needed support 30 years ago, and there was none, and there still isn't. So something's not working, and restating the position over and over and over again isn't working. There needs to be a change. And so I met with an anonymous person and a person we'll call Joe at a pub, and we spoke about what needed to be done. And it was perhaps one of their ideas, more so than mine, to set up a new campaigning organisation, and that manifested in the form of Factor 8. And I, as someone that had decided to be public, would kind of be the face of it in that sense. And that's pretty much how it started.
And so you've talked in your statement about there being 4 main campaign avenues for this overarching objective of getting a public inquiry: legal action, creating and distributing stories in the press, lobbying and political pressure, and then using social media. So those are the main means by which you sought to, you and those you were working with, sought to obtain the objective of a public inquiry.
Yeah, and some of those were things I had direct experience in. So, and still what I do for work now is marketing and PR. And so the social media aspect of it was my forte in a sense. I understood social media, content creation, advertising of campaigns, how to target demographics digitally and all that kind of thing. That was my bag. What I couldn't do, obviously, is the legal route. We needed a law firm, and I understood that. And also at that stage, certainly not the media part. I had by then become okay at being able to identify a document or small set of documents that could paint a simple story for the press of a certain aspect of what happened. But I couldn't have written an article. So yeah, they were the main avenues. And then of course the political stuff, we needed MPs, we needed people in the House of Lords to raise the issues there, to submit the written questions. And fortunately, because of the work that everyone else had been doing for all the years prior, there were already those key figures, and of course those that had come and gone over the years. I mean, I think if you go all the way back, I think it was Jack Ashley who was quite an ardent supporter originally, and then over the years there'd be different people, whether it was Lord Morris or, you know, more recently Diana Johnson or Andy Burnham, Alistair Burt at a time. So at different stages in time there had been those key politicians, and a number of them were still there and ready to help, but I don't think it escaped anybody that everybody had their own MP that could be contacted.
And in terms of the campaign objective of a public inquiry, am I right in understanding that it was important to you and those who you were working with on this, that it should be a statutory public inquiry? Because, as we'll come on to, you had concerns about documents or people not giving answers and politicians not answering questions, and so you wanted an inquiry that would have the power to compel the provision of documents, compel the attendance of witnesses.
We were super clear about that from the beginning, and we were in danger of having, and I don't disparage a Hillsborough panel at all. I think it worked in that situation, but we had, I say we as in the collective, we as in the community, perhaps not me personally, but the community had been there before with Archer, for example. And when I was just talking about looking at the history of campaigning and what had gone right and wrong, the lesson had been learnt from Archer of what happens when you don't have a statutory inquiry, or an inquiry with basically no funding for that matter. So yeah, that was a battle that we had to have again, or not a battle as such, but it was a mission to convince the community and those that were in power to decide what shape this inquiry was going to take, that was the way forward for us.
Now, part of what you do is research, investigation. I'm going to come on to that. In terms of Factor 8, there's a website that's maintained. It's a source of information, or intended as a source of information for people.
Yes.
There are, I think, online discussion groups. There are events, people meet up. So there's an element of mutual support, is that right?
Yeah, I think the support part is a major thing, and until the world that we live in now came about, we did, about 3 Christmas meetup events where it does tend to be usually the only time we'll see each other is for this, or an APPG, or to do a protest, or what we call business. And those events where people could just get together and socialise without that mental baggage of a day like this was super important. And I think probably was super important for the reason that those McFarlane Trust men's weekends were important, in that it is just a chance to socialise and be with people that get it in a way that people that aren't impacted by it will never get it from an emotional point of view. And so that support element is really important, and meeting people in person. You know, the online groups are great, and we have them, but I'm a strong believer that the in-person stuff, that there are a number of people that have come to those kind of events, even people I've met in the last couple of weeks here, that have either never met someone else impacted by this before or live in total isolation. And I'm a strong believer that those people need in-person interaction with other people impacted.
And in terms of the membership or constituents of Factor 8, is it focused upon, as the name would suggest, those who are in some sense affected, whether as direct recipients of treatment or as families, treatment with factor concentrates?
Yes, and the reason for that is simple. Again, I may be right, I may be wrong, but my view from an early stage was that the focus here needs to be on the product. The product is what infected people. The product is what has killed people. And it's one of those things, it always seems odd to me when you'll hear a phrase that's used in the media all the time where it will say some people were infected through blood transfusion, some through haemophilia, which even if you had haemophilia treatment on the end to that, it's still, to me, it's kind of irrelevant in a way whether or not someone does or does not have haemophilia. What's important to me, the way I personally view it, is that product, the way it was made, the sources of where the raw material to make it came from and the way it was collected, that to me was important. And that's the thing I wanted to try to become, hesitate to use the word expert, but as knowledgeable about as possible as I could be, ultimately, because that is what had impacted my father. And so I understand there's the blood transfusion side. It's not consciously left out for any other reason than this is my focus. And focus, going back to that again and again, is the thing that I felt had been missing.
You've talked about the initial primary objective being obtaining a public inquiry. How, if at all, has the focus shifted in the following years? There is obviously an ongoing public inquiry. It's why you're here talking to us.
Yeah. That was the original objective, or if we can't get one, let's go to court. We ended up doing both, ironically. Once the public inquiry had been achieved, the focus was on initially getting it out of the Department of Health, got it to the Cabinet Office, big community effort. We were fortunate to achieve that. Then it was shaping it, statutory, judge-led, powers to compel, etc. Once the inquiry was up and running, obviously now it's difficult because now most of the time, certainly my time, is spent researching to field questions to yourself for hearings and whatnot. But above that, I suppose now the wider campaign objective is the compensation element. Because, again, another reason for not making the schemes a focus either way. And I think it's important to say that I'm well aware now, as I was well aware when I was deciding what the campaign focus should be, that from a selfish point of view, I could have said, let's just focus on the fatherless generation, which I know we'll come on to that, and let's try and get those who have lost parents included in the support scheme, which of course still needs to happen. But I could have just pursued that, and to be honest, with everything that's gone on over the last 6 years, I think that would have been much easier achieved than what has been. And from a selfish point of view, I could have said, well, that's me sorted. But I felt that it was even less so to do with the wider community, if I'm honest. I felt that if that happened, I still wake up tomorrow feeling like this isn't finished. And so I want to be able to wake up and feel that this is finished. Not the pain and the suffering, but the campaign is finished. And for me, changing a support scheme or whatever wasn't going to do that for me. So I don't know if I've answered the question there.
Okay. You mentioned the fatherless generation, and I just wanted to ask you a little about that. We've heard some about it from others, but what's the fatherless generation group, and how did that come to be established?
Yeah, so that is a subgroup, if you like, of Factor A, and it's led by Tony Ferrugia. I suppose its primary purpose is a support group more than anything else. It began life, I suppose, around the time of the 2017 BBC Panorama documentary, because people began coming forward online. They would contact myself, Tony. One of the first was Lauren Palmer, and so we felt let's set up a Facebook group that's just for those who have lost parents, because we were in a common place. And I suppose in a way it was kind of like where you had, let's say, Birchgrove or the Forgotten Few, where that was just for this specific group of people, which from the outside might seem to alienate people, but it's that common bond and that shared experience that makes those category-specific groups important and have a specific role, I think. So the Fatherless Generation is primarily a support group, although I think at times it does verge on campaigning, and certainly with the protests. There were a number of protests, 2016, 2017, where the Fatherless Generation had a fairly big presence. And I've got to be honest, I think Tony kind of has done a lot there. And, you know, it's all these little things in the campaign that don't get said, actually, like traipsing up and down to Westminster with banners and flyers and custom biscuits and all kinds of things. And I think the Secretary of the Inquiry may have seen Tony's banner that he stuck outside of where he was staying during the opening hearings, which had some choice words about AIDS on it. But so it has ventured into campaigning as well.
We're going to look at a number of the details of some of the work that you've undertaken, some of the campaigning activities. But before we do that, can I just want to ask you a couple of questions, broader, more reflective questions, if I may. What's the impact been of campaigning on you and on your life? We've heard from a number of individuals in the course of the week, and we have statements from other campaigners who haven't given oral evidence or haven't yet given oral evidence, which talks about a toll over decades. You've been involved in campaigning for a shorter period of time, for the reasons you've told us, but it's still not an insignificant period of time. What's the impact of that been?
The immediate one, but it was a conscious choice, was up until 2015, outside of, regular work, we all have hopes and dreams, and one of mine was musically based. I'm sure some people have seen the YouTube videos. And, that was my hope and my dream, as a young lad. And I had the opportunity to, meet some of my heroes and do things through doing that. But I made a conscious choice to abandon it, to do this. Because I felt that this would never go away. And, I felt that at the end of my life, I know it's a bit philosophical, but I'd rather look back and say I did something to do with this than music, which was perhaps my selfish interest. So I gave it up consciously, willingly. And I miss it, but that's probably the biggest personal impact, but then it's impacted on a lot of people around me. My mother, partners, even my friends, my friend circle. Even now I find myself, when I see my mates, I don't have a whole lot to talk about other than this, which they don't want to hear about. They'll ask about it out of politeness. But so it's to condense that, it's become my life, as it has for many people. You lose your life to it. You open the Pandora's box, and you never get out of it. I think that's probably it.
And then again, in broad terms, what are the main obstacles you've faced in, whether it's in the campaigning or investigation? As I say, we'll look at specific instances, but overall, what kind of obstacles have you come up against?
People in power that don't see this as a priority, so don't take action on it, or they consider action on it in the context of not what should happen, but what the impact of doing something might be on other areas. The crazy world of FOI, where you try to get information which you should be entitled to, and rather than exemptions, which are there for good reasons, being legitimately applied, instead it's decided that a piece of information shouldn't be in the public domain, so let's find any way we can not to let that happen. And also, going back to 2016, was finding any law firm to take this on. I paid someone in 2016 to make me an Excel spreadsheet of the first 100 personal injury law firms that come up in Google, and I contacted every single one of them. And they all said, the ones that got back to me at least, no, for various reasons. Some said, there's been inquiries, this has been dealt with, what do you want? Others said, this is too big and we're too small. Others, I think, probably just thought I was not stable in the allegations I was making. I think they were some of the main obstacles.
And the firm you did find to take it on is Collins, who represents you in the inquiry as well.
Yes.
One of the pieces of work you referred to, one of the means of achieving your campaign objective was potentially through litigation, and one of the pieces of work that you've done with others, with Collins, is the group litigation. I'm not going to ask you any details about that, but just broadly speaking, for anyone who doesn't know, what is that?
So, to put it in brief context, in the February of 2017, I was asked to attend a meeting, I think it was the second meeting I'd probably had with Andy Burnham, who was holding something I think he called the Justice Summit, where he'd brought together people impacted by different, what he saw as injustices. And I went, along with my anonymous friend, and we met families from Hillsborough, Birmingham pub bombings, Orgreaves, and some other things that escape my mind at this moment. And we all had about 5 or 10 minutes to explain our injustice. And I was informed on the day that was now my job, in a room of MPs, peers, journalists, lawyers, etc. So I did this, and it was very difficult. I'd never done anything like that before. Afterwards, I'm leaving. I got a business card from a law firm in Northern Ireland whose name escapes me. And I was saying goodbye to everyone, Des and Danny, and Danny said, give us a ring if you want. And I assumed that she was just being polite. Certainly my view of lawyers at that point was not good. I thought, I bet you'd be interested if it was a whiplash claim or something. So I thought she was just being polite. But wanting to pursue every avenue, I did contact Collins. Keeping this brief, in the April of 2017, I went, again with my anonymous friend, to see Collins. I took a bunch of documents that I felt were important. it was agreed that on that day, much to my and my friends' amazement, that they were going to issue a letter before action to the Department of Health in relation to my father, myself. And then Panorama was coming in the May 2017, and it became public then for the first time when Panorama aired, and it quickly became a group legal action, which I suppose I haven't mentioned, is looking at the big picture, trying to overturn the 1990 litigation, trying to get full common law damages. That was the purpose of it, and we had our first hearing in September 2017. I remember that like it was yesterday, because I, first of all, had never been in a courtroom like that before. I learned on that day that it was not good to not wear a suit jacket when you're the main claimant, so I've never forgotten that. But I remember I was just sat there with my hands clenched under the table that this application was going to be granted, and Senior Master Fontaine did grant it, and we then asked for it to be stayed in light of this inquiry, but it's there and it exists, and time will tell what becomes of it.
I asked you a few moments ago about obstacles, and one of the obstacles you referred to was those in power not listening or not wanting to take action. In your statement, you've paid tribute to the work of the APPG, who've tried, you've said, to raise issues over the years.
Yeah.
But you said in your statement, your impression is that progress is hindered due to the indifference of government ministers. And you talk about your impression being that when there are ministers there, they're there to deflect or defend rather than assist, make decisions or take action. I wonder whether you could elaborate on that a little. What's given rise to that impression?
A combination of meetings, but I think the one that really sticks out in my mind, and it's worth saying that I used to attend those meetings generally with the purpose of just listening. And it also has to be said that I think it is good that it's a parliamentary group where those of us impacted can attend it. You know, I think that was really good to have that kind of access. However, the one meeting that really sticks in my mind, at a guess it was 2016 or 2017, Jackie Doyle Price had come to that APPG meeting to address concerns around the schemes. And again, because that wasn't a focus for me, my intention was to just listen to this. And the way she behaved in that meeting, I couldn't believe it. In a sense, I'm sure people that had been doing this for longer than me took it as par for the course, but me being fresher to it, I could not believe the way that sick and dying people were fobbed off by this woman. People were pouring their hearts out, talking about how bad their lives were, how bad their health is. And you could tell that, and maybe that's part of being a minister, is that you deal with so many causes that you become indifferent to it. I don't know, but it was hard for me to watch it. And I could see the stress in people's faces, you know, I could see the how infuriated they were. And in particular, one widow who does have anonymity, so I won't say her name, was sat in the front row really trying to take this minister to task, utilising every kind of, in her mind, legal point that she thought that she could, but getting absolutely nowhere. And it just stuck with me, actually, as one, a reminder of how badly people are dealt with by ministers, but also two, of why I was not going to pursue a campaign which basically comprised of restating the position over and over again to people that frankly don't care and aren't going to do something unless they're forced to, either legally or by the sheer weight of public opinion. And I think that's demonstrated by, the 30th of April 2019 uplift that just so happened to be when the inquiry started, by the recent written ministerial statement that just so happened to come at the timing it did, and of course the announcement of the compensation framework study that just so happened to be announced the day before Matt Hancock gives evidence. It's obvious. And it was also, this same thing was stated by Lord David Owen at the Bad Blood documentary screening, where he said they will do as little as they can get away with in public opinion at the time. And I didn't want any part of playing into that game, but I think that pretty much sums up the indifference side of it.
I should have said so at the outset this morning. Jason's, in common with other witnesses this week and others whose evidence we're publishing, has made a number of observations, criticisms, sometimes significant criticisms about politicians, civil servants and others who have not, for the most part, had time yet to respond, and so no inference should be drawn from any lack of response. We are aware that some at least are working on statements for the inquiry, and no doubt will take such opportunity as they choose to respond to some of these observations.
Yes, I think those clinicians at earlier stages who responded had more time within which to consider, look at documents, put in a response.
Yes, it's no one's fault.
And plainly, reasonable time is to be afforded to anyone who is subject to criticism, whoever they are.
I want to come on to the world of FOI and perhaps ask you to tell us, first of all, what it is, what you mean by it, what an FOI request is, and perhaps you can just give us a whistle-stop tour of some of the terminology, because there'll be documents that we look at that might refer to Section 36 and the like. And
Yeah.
can you tell us, first of all, how you came to alight upon that as the tool, or one of the tools you wanted to use? I know there are other campaigners who've done likewise, but why it became an important tool for you and what it entails?
Well, FOI stands for Freedom of Information. There's an act in the law which entitles the public to information where it's economical and within the public interest, which is a running theme throughout it to do so. The reason why I'd picked that up as a thing to pursue is it became apparent to me during the course of wanting to research into this that the information that was available appeared to be incomplete, and in light of the fact that, you'll see in the written parliamentary questions following the Penrose inquiry, it was asked many times, when are the documents going into the National Archive? Where are the papers? It got dragged out for so long that in the course of that, I decided to get involved with submitting Freedom of Information requests, which originally, I think my early ones were quite badly drafted, but I suppose before I get into the content of the FOIs, it's important to say that it's a really important act. It's not perfect. I think one of its great limitations, which is an issue that the Information Commissioner is aware of, but Parliament have just not dealt with it yet, is the situation around private bodies that process data on behalf of public bodies. As it stands, most private bodies in that situation don't have to comply with FOI. The exception is that a minister can designate a private body as such. But the reason why this is relevant to us is the UKH CDO, which I know we'll touch on later, but just as an example, is a private body collecting and processing data on behalf of a public body. It's public information, but it's not subject to FOI, and therefore the doors are closed. That information is not coming out unless they decide to, rather than having an obligation by an act to provide certain data. In the wider context, I decided to use this as a tool to get information that I felt otherwise we weren't going to get.
And there are a number of defences or reasons public bodies can give for not providing information.
Yes.
Amount of time it would take, amount of money it would cost. And then there's Section 36.
Yes, there's a number of what the ICO, the Information Commissioner, calls exemptions. These are reasons why a public body wouldn't be obliged to disclose information to someone asking for it. There are common ones that you tend to come up against from government departments pertaining to things being or not being, in their view, in the public interest to being released. It can cover things like advice that is given to ministers. There's a common argument that's presented by a public body when they don't want to disclose information, which is that if they were to disclose all the advice that is given to ministers, it would have what they refer to as a chilling effect. In other words, it would inhibit the frank and openness of advice that is given to ministers. And many times when I've wanted to challenge a decision not to disclose material, I have made the argument that the public interest in the truth, the full truth about this issue coming out overrides that argument. And I've not always been successful in making that argument.
And is this right? You can ask for a review, so the body that you go to for information, if they say no, you can ask for a review of that, and ultimately you can go to the Information Commissioner, and you've done that on a number of occasions. We'll look at a couple of examples.
Yes, so there's a set process you have to go through with FOI where you have to ask for the information. If you don't get the information that you want, before you can even think about going to the Information Commissioner, you have to ask for what's called an internal review, where you're basically asking that same organisation to reconsider their original decision, an appeal basically. They then have to come back, and then at that stage you can then go to the ICO if you're not happy with the outcome of the appeal. But what's important to note is the time involved in each step of that process. For the original request, the body is meant to respond within 28 working days. If you then go to an internal review, so this is basically a month later, I don't believe there is actually a statutory limit on internal review, but they should still, in theory, respond in a month. But you're now 2 months gone on one FOI. You then need to go to the ICO if you still don't have the information, but you feel you should. That process usually takes more than a month. I don't think I've ever got an ICO decision back in less than a month. So that's 3 months. And that's assuming the public body does respond within the limit set out by the ICO, which for certain departments, Cabinet Office is a prime one, also the Department of Health, that in my experience almost never happens. So that's how you get to a situation where there are multiple examples where one FOI request from me has rumbled on for a year plus, trying to get one piece of information. And Stephen Snowden QC mentioned during the opening hearings of this inquiry about the information I was trying to get from the Treasury, and this process that I think we'll talk about later of how the Cabinet Office acts as the arbiter of what can and can't be released. And what this all amounts to is that you can spend a year of your life, well, I have spent a year of my life trying to get one piece of information in many cases. And so the idea that, getting to the truth of this issue without this inquiry, I don't think it ever would have happened, to be quite honest.
And before we break, and after the break, we'll look at some examples, but is this right, that when you do get material, it is often redacted?
Yes.
And the redactions, obviously, we as an inquiry apply our own redactions. We've seen some of them in particular in relation to personal data. So there'll be personal data type redactions. But am I right in understanding that the redactions of the material that you get often go much wider than that?
Yes, and I have no problem with the personal redactions under FOI, sections 40, section 42. Totally get that. If there's a patient name on something, no one expects that wouldn't be redacted. But often the redactions that are applied are nothing to do with that. They are to do with this, this is advice to ministers that we don't want to disclose. It wouldn't be in the public interest to disclose this information for a number of reasons. There is actually quite a wide arsenal of exemptions that they can use to argue the public interest point. However, I have also had it from Scottish authorities, and Scotland have their own separate FOI Act, where they have exempted personal information that shouldn't be exempted. And by that I'm talking about the names of doctors, for example. And doctors whose names we all know in relation to this story. However, in fairness to them, when I had then challenged it, they did agree to remove the redactions. But it's, I feel with the exemptions, it's always erred on the side of caution. And I don't know if perhaps now is a good time to go to the Cabinet Office emails, which show the approach that public bodies take. I can probably give you the reference. So it's JEVA 5026 _ 302.
Is it JEVA 26? Say.
Yes.
Yeah. We'll probably have it just as JEVA 26, shall Nick?
That's it. So, to put this in context, this is an email chain from within the Cabinet Office. Yeah, if we could have the whole document, please. So Erin Atkins is a civil servant who deals with FOI. Brian Williams is one of the lead sponsor officials for this inquiry, as is, Sue Gray is a senior official for this inquiry as well. People know her from other areas of work. But the thing I want to point out here is two things, really. First of all, there's much more to this email chain discussion, which effectively reveals that it's been decided that this information I was asking for from the Treasury, which were files connected with the HIV litigation, the Treasury wanted to give it to me, but the Cabinet Office didn't want them to, is to make it simple. But the part I want to highlight is the sentence towards the bottom there, where Sue Gray has said, "Personally, I would favour the inquiry releasing the information in a managed way, redacted." Now, that redaction, the Cabinet Office know this, so I'm not giving anything away. They made a mistake when they disclosed these emails to me, and they forgot to what's called flatten the PDF. So I was able to extract the text from it and see what that redaction says. And what it actually says is, as we tried to do with the Chilcot inquiry. You can see the sentence below that says, the Treasury team will need to do a lot of consultation with former ministers who I suspect will be very sore about. And then on it, it says this. I feel that I understand the inquiry has its process, but I feel we've waited long enough to have the truth and to have the information. And I couldn't care less about Sue Gray's view that this should be ran like the Chilcot inquiry and we should wait. People are going to die before this inquiry finishes. And so I think there should be full transparency with the information now. I don't think we should be managed in that way. And as far as ministers feeling sore about it, I mean, I don't think that factors into the concerns of the people here. That's all I have to say about that document. Thank you.
So if we take a break now, and then we'll come on to some more examples after the break.
Yes, certainly. So we'll take a break now until 10 to 12. You've heard me say on a number of occasions what the rules are. You're giving evidence. You mustn't talk about the evidence you have given or any evidence you think you may yet give. Whoever you're talking to, anything else is fine.
Yes, thank you.
10 to 12.